other resources. Okay, so now that we're recording, Mark, I'll go ahead and let you get started.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Hannah, for that, and thank y'all for being here tonight, taking some time to talk a little bit about food plots, and hopefully this is provide some good information for folks that are interested in managing food plots and improving their food plot management. Like Hannah said, I'm Mark Turner. I'm at OSU, and I'm an assistant professor and wildlife extension specialist. And so do a lot of work related to game species management, predominantly, especially deer and turkey and quail, especially related to habitat management for those species, which would include things like prescribed fire, forest management, and food plots as well. And so obviously tonight talking about food plots, but if there's any questions that come up regarding other management for those species, definitely happy to take those. So, as y'all know, and as a lot of folks are really interested in and thinking about planting wildlife food plots and how they can better manage their land to meet various objectives. And so, food plots are a piece of the puzzle that we oftentimes use in order to meet various objectives. So, we can think about things like providing additional forage for deer or insects for turkeys, as well as just general attraction during the hunting season. And certainly food plots can help us accomplish all of those. But we do need to think about being strategic as well as, relatively having reasonable expectations of what our food plots are actually going to do for us. And so why might we want to think about planting food plots? Well, you could be interested in increasing antler size, and certainly, although again, we need to be reasonable, food plots can provide additional forage availability, especially whenever we consider them as part of a more holistic program, including things like prescribed burning or grazing or cutting trees or clearing cedars. Doing other things that influence forage availability. Certainly, food plots can help fill that gap. We can also think about, simply providing viewing opportunities for deer. And there's certainly nothing wrong with, occasionally harvesting a deer out of a food plot, but there's a lot of good and enjoyment that comes from, either taking your kid or going yourself and sitting in the stand and just watching deer that might be, using the food resources that you provided there. And we can also think about enhancing hunting success with food plots. Certainly, the reason that a lot of people plant food plots is to try to increase hunting success, but it's important to, be honest with yourself about why you want to plant food plots, because if you're really just thinking about hunting success, there are some things you could necessarily not consider for food plots. For example, if you're only worried about hunting success, you might only think about planting food plots in the fall as opposed to, planting some in the spring as well. Again, depending on what species you're interested in. And so, for that reason, it's really important to define your objectives and think about number one, why are you planting the food plot? Number two, and this is perhaps most important, what wildlife species are you actually trying to manage for both on your property as well as specifically in the food plot? For example, are you trying to have a place that you're attracting deer regularly during the rifle season, or maybe during the bow season, maybe during both? Are you thinking about trying to manage an impoundment for waterfowl? We can certainly plant food plots in areas of impoundments to increase the attraction and the food availability for ducks. We can also manage food plots for turkeys, whether that involves specifically planting things for turkeys or just managing the vegetation, the quote unquote weeds that might be coming up in the food plot during the springtime. The structure of those plants and the growth of those plants can be good for turkeys, but again, there are some things that I might not plant in a deer food plot if I also have turkey objectives because they're going to grow too tall for turkeys to use. Or maybe perhaps you'd like a place to go out and shoot a few dove in the evening. Certainly, there are ways to incorporate several of these objectives together, but it's important to specifically consider why you're actually planting a food plot before you just start buying a bag of seed and throwing it out. Because if you want to plant a dove plot, for instance, there are lots of things that you would plant for dove that you would not be all that attractive to deer. So again, it's important to define those objectives before you pick what seed and start throwing seed in the ground. Before I dive too much deeper on this, it's important to consider that food plots don't replace more holistic habitat management practices. And so, you know, Yes, food plots are good, and most of this talk I'll be focused on, how to better manage food plots for deer specifically. But I'd be remiss if I didn't at least talk a little bit about how, there are other practices that we might do to manage wildlife outside of food plots, because the reality is most folks have, say, 1 to 5% of their property in food plots, even if they're managing for wildlife. And if we're only relying on food plots to feed deer, number one, it's pretty cost prohibitive. But number two, we're also not providing near as much as we could as if we managed areas of native vegetation. For example, if we just manage, old fields, early successional areas, grassland areas, whatever you want to call it, if we just manage fields and manage them for native plants using things like uh, non-native species control and prescribed burning, maybe some grazing, maybe some disking, again, just depends on what the field has. But we can do that at a cost of less than $25 an acre and produce at least 800 pounds of forage per acre. Now, food plots can produce more forage per acre on average, say 2 to 4,000 pounds per acre, but they cost much, much more than just managing fields for native vegetation. So again, I say all that not to say don't plant food plots, but just simply to say that think outside of the food plots as well as within the food plots when we're thinking about trying to feed deer. Because if you're trying to maximize body and antler size for deer, as well as just attraction for deer, you're not going to do that by food plotting alone. There's a lot that you're leaving on the table that's very cost effective. And then the other thing too is that food plots don't really provide cover. And so certainly if you're thinking about things like fawning cover or turkey nesting cover, you can't do that in a food plot very effectively. So again, it really just comes down to managing that native vegetation is really critical. So don't overlook that when you're starting to think about planting food plots. But if you are thinking about planting food plots, and I encourage a lot of landowners to plant food plots and pretty commonly recommend it, once you've kind of defined your objectives, you want to think about not necessarily jumping to, okay, what am I going to plant? But think about when am I going to plant more so and what types of plants am I going to manage? For example, we can plant warm season annuals, things such as this is a food plot with some cowpeas and some joint vetch, and you can also see some dead standing sunflowers that were planted there for structure. This is a plot that we planted in say April or May, and it's going to provide forage all the way until frost. During that time, whenever bucks are growing antlers, does are lactating. Certainly, if we're trying to maximize nutrition, having some areas that we plant during the summertime is can be beneficial. Again, I'm not relying on these to feed deer, but they can be a little added bonus and be very attractive for deer, particularly during bow season. We also think about cool season annual plantings, and so those would be things that we would plant in the fall, and they're going to provide forage for up to a year following planting. And so this picture shows a field of arrowleaf clover. You can also see some dead oats and wheat seed heads. They were planted that all of this was planted in the fall, but this picture is actually taken in May. And that just shows that, hey, we could plant something in September and provide forage availability with various species included in a planting all the way through, much of the following growing season. And so that's really a tremendous way to get more bang for your buck with food plots. And then finally, we can think about planting cool season perennials, which would include things like white clover, red clover, alfalfa, and chicory. Those are kind of the primary perennials that I think about. And so for the rest of this talk, I'm really going to focus in on these two. Not that warm season annuals are not useful, but they're not the focus of most people's food plot programs for deer. And also just based on the time of year, it's a good time of year to start thinking about, okay, what am I going to plant in my food plots this fall? So we're really going to focus on those cool season plantings. Again, like I mentioned, you can kind of define what species that you'd like to plant your food plots for, and I think it's important to do that before you begin. We've got some resources regarding food plots for doves, food plots for waterfowl, etc. But for today, I'm just going to focus mostly on deer and a little bit on turkeys because most people plant food plots for those two species, and you know those are the species that we're thinking about planting for this time of year. If you wanted to have a dove field, unfortunately, or even plant a waterfowl impoundment, most of those are going to be planted in the springtime. And so once you've kind of identified, okay, what am I planting a food plot for? What species? And what are my specific objectives for that food plot? You want to think a little bit about, okay, where am I going to put this plot? What does my site selection look like? And oftentimes, again, people jump to, well, this is where I have fields and this is where I have woods, so I'm going to plant the fields. Well, that works out pretty well sometimes. Other times there could be better approaches and better locations for it. And so thinking, having a little bit of consideration about your site selection can be pretty important on the front end. Of course, topography is number one. Whether an area is currently fields or currently woods, if it's a super steep slope, I'm not going to recommend planting it. Not only is that going to be unsafe to manage, you might have erosion problems. So, you want a spot that's relatively flat to plant a food plot in. That's pretty common sense. But you're also going to want to think about the soils that are in that area. Certainly, you can take advantage of the NRCS has a soil resource survey online that you can look at the productivity of various soils on your property to identify, well, this area is good for food plots. This area is relatively poor. So that's one thing you could consider. I also like to think about access. Not only can I get equipment to the food plot, but also, is this going to be an area that I'm going to be spooking deer off of? If I'm planting a food plot for hunting, for example, I never want to plant it next to either a road, such as a paved road, or even a road or a trail that I might have to drive right through to get to the rest of my property. I've seen far too many people put food plots in the field right by the gate, and that is just asking for problems because every single time you drive in and out of your property, you're spooking deer off of it. And so I'm not saying that you have to plant it in the most remote location possible, but if you can place it at least 100 yards or a few hundred yards away from trails that you might use for access, either onto or off of the property or getting to and from your deer stand. That's going to go a long ways towards reducing the number of deer that you're spooking whenever you're actually hunting that food plot. So again, just having some common sense thinking about, not putting your food plots where you have to access on and off the property is important. And then the last thing that goes with that, because you might be thinking, well, the only field on my entire property is right there, smack, next to the gate. Well, if you think outside the box a little bit, you don't necessarily have to use existing openings for food plots. It is possible to clear areas for food plots. And yes, this can be costly. And again, it depends on how much, energy that you want to put into and planning that you want to put into it. But I've been on several properties where, we had to take fields that were next to the gate and manage those for native forage and, just native cover such that deer, they might use it some, but they're not going to be in and out of that field every single night the way that they would be if we had planted that as a food plot. And so thinking a little bit creatively about you can clear woods and turn that into a field. And there's other places that you could plant, such as fire breaks or say if you have just some small openings that you can expand just using some hand tools. I mean, you can think outside the box a little bit. And I'll go into kind of small food plots here in a little bit, but you don't have to just think about, okay, this is where I've got a big field. I need to plant this spot. Thinking about it creatively can be pretty beneficial. So every single person that ever talks about food plots mentions this, and I'm going to do it too because it really is one of the most important steps to having a successful food plot, and that's soil testing. And so, again, I'm not going to belabor the point. If you've never taken a soil test, there's some great resources through your local county extension office regarding how to take a soil test, how to interpret the soil test results, but really for the very minimal cost. You're really going to be way ahead because say you pull a soil test and you realize, oh, well, actually, I don't need to apply as much fertilizer as I thought I did. Well, that's great. On the flip side of that, if you need to apply more fertilizer or more lime than you would have just guessed, or what the bag of seed says on the back of it, you're really actually, even though you might think of it as maybe you're spending more money, which is true, you are in some way saving money because you're preventing money from being wasted. Because if you plant a food plot and it doesn't grow and doesn't attract deer, well, all the money that you spent was wasted. And so I say that just just to say I can't say that strongly enough that you ought to be collecting soil samples on your plots at least every couple years, and amending the soil appropriately, because again, for all the time and money and energy that we put into food plots, if we don't get the soil right at the start, we're wasting a lot of that money that we're spending on the plots. Okay, so let's assume that you've gotten a soil test, you've got the soil report, and now you got to think about, okay, how am I actually going to amend the soil to get it where it needs to be? The first thing to consider is lime. So, of course, you'll get the soil test results back. You'll get some result for the soil pH. Oftentimes, there's a need to lime the soil because you may have some acidic soils on your property. Again, it depends property to property and site history and the type of soil that you have. But in many cases, you're going to need to apply some lime. And again, lime, people often jump to fertilizer, but lime, getting the pH right is really, really important, because if you don't get the pH of the soil right, you're actually having a lot of nutrients that are locked up that are not able to be accessed by the plant. So even if you've got a bunch of fertilizer that you put out, if you don't have the soil limed appropriately or the pH appropriate, the plants are not actually having access to those nutrients. And so, getting lime in the ground is important. It's important to do this early. I mean, if you are taking a soil test today, I would, the day that I got it back, make sure just try to get lime on the ground as quick as possible, because really you're thinking more so probably 6 months down the road for that to have the full effect. But it's better to apply it when you plant than to not apply it at all. So if you can apply it early, great. If you can only apply it the same day that you plant, that's fine. Just understand that it's not going to fix things immediately. It is going to take, several months for that lime to bring that pH up. One thing that a lot of folks have questions about is whether to apply ground lime, or some folks would call it ag lime. That's that, powdered or pulverized material that you can see being spread in this picture, compared to pellet lime. There's some pros and cons. Generally, ground or pulverized lime is much cheaper. However, it is more difficult to spread. Generally, you're going to need a spreader, as you can see there. You can't just spread it out of, say, a typical, cyclone spreader that would be on the 3-point hitch of a tractor, or, if you're using hand tools, you can't spread ground or pellet or pulverized lime out of those tools. Whereas pelletized lime, you can spread them out of just a typical cyclone type spreader or even a hand spreader pretty easily. The thing to Not to get too far in the weeds on this, but a lot of people would say that the pelletized lime doesn't take as much lime to work. And so even though you're paying more, you're actually saving money, because you only have to apply, some people would say, a couple bags of pelletized lime versus a bunch of bags of ground lime. And again, to keep from diving too far into this, that's simply not the case in most instances. Lime that you would get from most reputable dealers, is all pretty similar with regards to its neutralizing value. And so if your soil test says you need 1 ton of lime per acre, you're going to apply about a ton of ground or pulverized, or about a ton of pellet. Either way, you're coming out about the same. So, if anybody says, oh, well, you only need to apply this small little amount if you use pellet lime, I would raise your eyebrows. That's probably not the case. All right, so you amend the soil with lime, and then you think about fertilizer next. The three macronutrients that we generally think about for fertilizer are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And again, it's nice and handy because the bag of fertilizer has on there exactly how much is in there. And so this bag is a 40-pound bag, and it clearly shows that it's 13% nitrogen, 13% phosphorus, and 13% potassium. And so that tells us pretty easily how many pounds that you need. One thing that I think a lot of folks would be well ahead of the ball game and save themselves a lot of money on is think about trying to get nutrient specific soil amendments as opposed to a more complete. And so this bag here, 13, 13, 13, it's 13% of each of those nutrients. So that would be what we would call a complete fertilizer. Well, most of the time, your soil test is not going to call for the same amount of every nutrient. And in fact, if you're planting things like clover, you may not need to apply any nitrogen at all. And so you'd actually be better off applying something like 0 20 20 or, you know, 0 45 0, and then also have some bags of 0 0 60. Again, there's all sorts of formulations, but the point is go to your fertilizer dealer, show them how much you need based on your soil test, and try to work it out where you're actually applying, just you might just be buying bags of just phosphorus and some bags that are just potassium in it, and that's all good. But you're going to be ahead doing it like that as opposed to just buying a typical bag of say 13 13 13 or 10 10 10. Because again, for some things like legumes that fix their own nitrogen, you actually don't really need to apply any nitrogen to the soil in most cases. So, that 13 number there at the front of this bag is actually just wasted money, unfortunately. And so that's one good way to just save some money. I know fertilizer is pretty expensive. So any way that you can be more efficient with your application by actually picking the nutrients that you're trying to apply is going to put you ahead of the ball game. All right. So after you've amended the soil, the next thing I like to think about is weed control. And it's really easy to overlook this. Again, you may notice up until this point, I've not talked hardly at all about what species we're planting because that's what everybody wants to jump to. But really thinking about getting the soil right and how are you going to control weeds in the food plot is much more important than what specific seed that you're going to plant. And so thinking about what weeds you're likely to be dealing with, what's the field look like now? What plants are out there now? What do I think are going to, come up out of the ground after I start either disking it or planting it? Because again, there's a lot of very effective herbicides that are really inexpensive to use. But if you aren't thoughtful about it and don't have a plan for weed control, you're going to be pretty far behind the boat when it comes to food plots. And there's a lot of interest in planting food plots without herbicides. I'm aware of several research projects that are looking at that. But if you're unwilling to use herbicide at all, I would say probably just steer clear of food plots because you can certainly minimize herbicide use, and I'm all for minimizing herbicide use. I don't think that you need to apply as much herbicide in a food plot as you would as most row crop farmers do. But at the end of the day, it's difficult to manage a lot of the weed pressure that we have in food plots without using some herbicides because most of the time we're planting a relatively small area. The deer are very attracted to what we planted, so the deer are actually hurting us in some ways because they're reducing the height of the forage. The weeds are then growing if they're not plants that deer eat. And so just understanding, the relative importance of weed management in food plotting is a good place to be. There's several different types of herbicides that we commonly use in food plots. We have post-emergence herbicides, which would be those that we spray on actively growing plants. Something like glyphosate is an example of a post-emergence herbicide. But then we also have pre-emergence herbicides that we would spray that have some residual soil activity, such that they prevent actively, germinating plants from being established. And so that picture on the right, you can see that's a cornfield, corn food plot, use a selective pre-emergence herbicide called dual magnum on it. And as you can see, we've got hardly any plants growing in that field except for corn. Now, there are some other plants that are going to establish over time, but we've got that corn up past that really critical point, whenever it would have been very sensitive to competition. And so pre-emergence herbicides are one that, not a lot of people use in food plots, but I think more people should look into them. They can work pretty well. Okay, so that's kind of one way to break down herbicides, but within each of those categories, we also have other types of herbicides. And so, the first post versus pre is kind of, okay, what am I spraying this on actively growing plants or am I spraying this on the soil? we also can think about what types of plants that an herbicide is going to control. And so we have broad spectrum herbicides such as glufosinate and glyphosate. Again, glyphosate being Roundup, or at least it formerly was Roundup. It still is sold as Roundup in some places, but if you go to, say, a store like Lowe's now and try to get Roundup, if you look on the label, it's actually not glyphosate anymore. They changed some of their consumer market, and so it's kind of frustrating that what's being sold as Roundup, which has been the trade name for this herbicide for so long, is now technically a different herbicide altogether. So anyway, that's why I use the chemical name glyphosate. But again, glufosinate or Liberty is another one. Broad spectrum herbicides, probably all familiar with them. You spray them and they kill pretty much anything that's actively growing there. There's not much selectivity going on. We can also use grass selective herbicides. And so grass selective herbicides such as clethodim are ones that I use a lot in a food plotting situation because there's a lot of problematic grass weeds. Here in this picture, we've got a crimson clover field. The right side of that picture, I sprayed it with clethodim. And then the left side, I did not spray it with clethodim. And as you can see, the crimson clover is being outcompeted by grasses. Specifically here, this is ryegrass, which is not desirable for food plots. It's not a selected deer forage, and it's really reducing the attractiveness of this field for deer. So I use a fair amount of clethodim just to control grasses in food plots. We also have broadleaf selective herbicides such as 2,4-D or dicamba. Again, broadleaf selective herbicides, they kill broadleaf plants. They do not kill grasses. So you could spray things like 2,4-D on grass crops like corn and effectively not kill the corn, but kill broadleaf plants that are competing. And then finally, the category that is in some ways the most confusing, but also another one that I use a lot, is broad spectrum selective. And so, as the name suggests, these herbicides kill a broad spectrum of plants. So they kill some grasses and they kill some broadleaf plants, but they're selective so they don't kill every grass or every broadleaf plant. So in this case here, I've got a picture of a food plot. The right side of this picture is an excellent stand of joint vetch that I planted in the summertime. The left side was also planted a joint vetch, but I did not spray it pre-emergence with imazethapyr, which is commonly sold as Pursuit. And so as you can see, there's a bunch of foxtail that's come on, and that's outcompeted the planted forage. And so again, broad spectrum selective herbicides are really useful to help control some problem grasses and some problem broadleaves. But again, you got to read the label and understand what's going on to know whether it's going to kill this or that, depending on what's available. And so something that oftentimes pretty commonly comes up, next we can think about is how do we actually all right, I got a question here from Arthur. What are your thoughts on spreading mineral salt on your food plot fields? So if you're thinking about spreading minerals to actually, hopefully increase the nutrient availability of, things like phosphorus, that would be, I'm assuming that's kind of what you're thinking is basically spreading additional, nutrients to help increase that. Yeah, so I don't generally recommend that. If there were specific micronutrient deficiencies that would pop up on your soil test, I would think about that. But at the end of the day, number one, salt is not necessarily something that you want to be spreading on the fields because it can have some negative effects on the plant growth. But the other thing to think about is that the species that we select and just getting those macronutrients in line, again, that nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, that's really going to take the lion's share of, potential problems down the road with regards to nutrient levels out of the way. So generally, no, I'm not going to think about spreading mineral salt specifically on the fields because, again, salt in and of itself is not necessarily a good thing to promote plant growth. And I've tried all sorts of you know food plot how do I say this, like food plot additives, if you will, to try to increase deer use and things like that. Tested all sorts of those, and really at the end of the day, it's hard to just beat normal lime, normal fertilizer, and a sensible seed selection paired with good weed control. A lot of that stuff is marketed really heavily, and I'm not saying that it would never work, but I'm not going to spend my money on it for the most part. So, but good question, absolutely. Um, so in terms of conventional planting steps, there's conventional and then there's no-till planting. I'll kind of work through conventional planting first, because again, after you've got the soil right, you've got your weed control plan, you need to think about, okay, how am I going to get the seed in the ground and get a good seed bed and get it established? Because again, that's really important relative to all the other things with regard to what seed do I plant. Making sure that you get it established is really critical. And so, generally, the first step in most situations, I'm going to think about killing the existing plants, usually just using glyphosate as a burn down herbicide. Um, in some cases, if I've got some really dense grasses, especially things like fescue or Bermuda grass or old world blue stem, I may need to think about maybe mowing the field a couple of times just to make sure that I have a good, actively growing plants prior to applying that herbicide. Because again, you want to make sure that you get a good kill. If you don't get a good kill of the plants that are there, you're going to have problems going forward. So I'm going to really focus in, make sure I get a good kill on those existing plants. Again, I'm then going to amend the soil. If you're planting conventionally, I recommend, incorporating that fertilizer and lime into the soil, disking it in or tilling it in, just to ensure better, more surface area contact with that amendment. Again, it's not 100% necessary, especially obviously if you're no-tilling, but especially with lime, mixing it into the soil is better than not. And then I'm going to think about preparing the seed bed. And so most of the time, again, using tillage, but again, if you're in a situation where you have a relatively small tractor, maybe you don't have the heaviest equipment, one way to potentially remove all that thatch that was there following the herbicide treatment is to simply burn the field off. And so in this picture here, got a relatively small tractor with a small disc. I burned the field off, and now I'm just going through and disking it, and it's much easier to disc without that dense thatch layer. So that can kind of help save you some time and energy. After I disc it once and, obviously incorporate that fertilizer and lime into the soil, I'm then going to think about planting the larger seeds. So these would be things like cereal grains like wheat or cereal rye or oats, soybeans, even something like corn if I'm planting it, broadcasting, which I've done in food plots several times successfully. You're going to want to plant those first and then just disc over the field relatively shallow. Again, only disking about an inch or two deep to incorporate those seeds into the soil. Disking too deep is a big problem here, so you do not want to disc it heavily. But again, if you are just going to broadcast the seed onto the soil after you've disked it once or twice. So disc it a couple times, broadcast the seed, and then just run over it, just shallow disking to just incorporate it that 1 or 2 inches deep. And then I'm going to want to cultipack it. And so a cultipacker is really, really important to have to use. I do have a workaround I'll share in a second, but basically what a cultipacker does is it just takes all those air pockets, it firms up the seed bed, and it prepares it for, ensuring that you have good seed to soil contact. Because again, a lot of the time, if you just disc bigger seeds in, they're not really getting packed in. And so there's going to be air pockets here and there. And whenever that rootlet comes out of that seed, it's going to have trouble getting into the soil. And oftentimes it's not going to make it. So a cultipacker is, to me, one of the most overlooked critical tools for food plotting. But what do you do if you don't have a cultipacker? I'm in that situation in several places myself. And so the alternative is just driving over the field with either a side by side or a light tractor or a four wheeler. Obviously it takes some time. I'm not talking about just, running up the field or anything like that, but basically just driving down and then turning around and making that pass back over, such that you firm it up in a similar way that a cultipacker would. So again, you can see how that sole's firmed up behind that cultipacker. You're getting similar response with the side by side or the four wheeler, but again, you're going to have to go over the field several times to hit those spots that are between the tires. But it works. It works a lot better than not doing it. I will absolutely say that, even though it does take some time. So after you've cultipacked the field, I then like to go ahead and plant my smaller seeds, which would include clovers, brassicas, radishes, things that are relatively small seed in size. And then, if possible, I like to actually cultipack it again just to make sure that I'm pressing that seed into the soil. But again, if you're planting smaller seeds like clovers and brassicas, one of the biggest, most common mistakes that I see folks making is planting them without cultipacking. You can get away with planting wheat if you don't cultipack. I mean, it's not going to be nearly as good. But if you plant small seeds and you don't cultipack, and then you get like an inch of rain, oftentimes that seed is getting pushed way too deep. And so, with air pockets that are left in the soil. So if you do nothing else there, just understand that you got to firm that seed bed up before you plant those smaller seeds. If you do have opportunities to plant no-till, again, that's an excellent way to do things like conserve soil moisture, build soil organic matter, and also, hopefully in the long run, save yourself some money on some fertilizer, and you're definitely saving money on diesel fuel, not having to disc the field multiple times. But basically, if you're no-tilling using a drill, you're going to kill the existing plants, amend the soil, and then just use a no-till drill and drill those seeds in. Again, the downside of no-till drilling is that no-till drills are very expensive, and if you don't have access to one and can't rent one, probably not something that you're going to look to purchase. The workaround for this is no-till top sowing, and this is something that I've done on a lot of food plots, relatively small food plots, areas that I didn't have access with equipment. You can plant food plots without having a drill, without disking, but you got to do it pretty strategically and time it with rain. So basically, if I'm trying to plant no-till top sowing, I'm going to kill the existing plants with herbicide, amend the soil, all that's still important, but then I'm going to simply spread the seed into the standing dead vegetation, using smaller seeds like clovers or wheat. Those do pretty well with this. And a couple of things are pretty important here. Number one, you're going to need to increase the seeding rate because there's much less efficiency if you're just broadcasting plants into dead plant material, dead plant material. Some of that is not going to reach the soil. But with that being said, even if you increase the seeding rate, you're not going to be able to make up for a lack of seed to soil contact. So if you have a field that's, say, just dense grass and you can't even see your boots, that's not going to work for no-till topsowing because again, you've got to have some bare soil. Even if there can be some taller standing plants, but if you pull those back and look down and can't see some soil in between them, you're going to have problems. And so, usually if I know that I'm going to be planting an area no-till topsowing, I might spray it several times over the course of the summer, let that material break down a little bit, and then I can just simply go through, in the fall, no-till topsoil after that last spraying, know that it's going to reach the soil, and then again with no-till topsowing, you're really thinking about timing it to spread the seed just before rain. But again, as you can see in the picture, we can have very successful food plots with no-till topsowing. You just got to understand that there are some drawbacks and there's some considerations, and you absolutely have to control the competition. If you just go out there and throw seed, onto actively grown plants, you're just wasting your money. All right, so the timing of planting is really critical to ensure success, and the timing of planting depends on the species that you're trying to plant. For example, if I'm planting something like brassicas, I might plant them slightly earlier than if I'm planting something like clovers or wheat. So it does depend a little bit on the species, but just across the board in Oklahoma, just general rule of thumb, I try to wait till September to start planting, and then anytime from September 1 until the end of October, I could think about planting, but I do want to plant prior to rainfall. And so my recommendation would be for sitting here right now in early August, I would not just go start dumping seed on the ground. I would start thinking, okay, let's get the food plots ready, let's get them amended, get the weeds controlled, And then starting September 1, I'm going to be thinking about starting to plant then and planting all the way through the end of October. Again, just hoping for rain at that point. You can get away with planting some species like I said, turnips a little bit earlier in say mid to late August. But again, for most of your clovers and cereal grains, I'm waiting till September to start planting those. All right. So we got all the way to here, and I finally come to the question that most people ask: what should I plant in my food plot? Well, again, it's important to consider all those things we talked about before in terms of why you're planting a food plot. When do you want to attract deer to your food plot? For example, if you only rifle hunt, you might not worry about having a food plot in October that's attracting deer. Whereas if you only bow hunt, maybe November is not as important for you to attract deer. Again, just thinking about why you're planning and the timing of that attraction can be really helpful to consider. But another thing that I like to tell folks is just keep it relatively simple. It's fun to try different things with food plots, but you don't have to buy a bag of seed that has a big deer on the bag, and you don't have to overcomplicate it. Just keep it relatively simple. Do the important things right. Amend the soil, control your weeds, get a good seed bank established, or excuse me, a good seed bed established. Make sure that you plant your seeds at the appropriate depth, etc. All those things are way more important than the specific species that you plant. So just keeping it relatively simple and sensible is really the best approach. So I'm going to go through some specific species and then move on to some blends that I like to use. In terms of cool season annuals, cereal grains are probably the most common thing that folks plant for deer in Oklahoma and honestly throughout a good part of the country. And wheat really to me is kind of the workhorse of fall food plots. It's a great overall option. It can be drilled, it can be broadcast, it can also be no-till top sowed. When I'm, thinking about what can I plant in any food plot that's going to give me some success, wheat is a good option. Now, I like to plant a relatively short variety of wheat, and I generally like to plant an awnless variety of wheat. And that is because, number one, I like turkeys and I like turkey hunting. So I'm going to plant a shorter variety of wheat that's not going to grow as tall so that turkeys feel more comfortable using that plot in the spring. Again, if you're just worried about deer, forget the short part. But the awnless part is important. And so you can see in that picture there, the wheat do not have long awns or beards, the long sticky part that would be on the end of those seeds that a lot of wheat varieties have. So a lot of wheat varieties that are planted for agronomic purposes have awns or beards. But I recommend planting a awnless or beardless variety of wheat because deer and turkeys will hammer those wheat seed heads if you don't have awns on them. So you're basically just getting some free production. Most of the time when I'm planting wheat, I'm thinking mostly about the attraction while it's green and actively growing in the fall. But you might as well plant a variety that's also going to provide some additional food in the spring once it goes to seed. If I'm either planting it for turkeys or I'm trying to manage it with other things like crimson clover, as you see in this picture, I'm generally going to plant a reduced seeding rate of something like 40 to 50 pounds per acre. And then the last thing I really like about wheat is that it provides outstanding brooding cover for turkeys as well as quail if you just let it go fallow during the summertime. So, once it's gone to seed, just simply let the plot sit there, let the quote unquote weeds come on, and don't worry about trying to clean the plot up. Just let it do its thing because that's going to be better for turkeys and quail as opposed to going and mowing it and making things clean. Oats are kind of your next option for fall food plots. Again, oats are a good option. They are slightly more attractive to deer than wheat, but unless you plant them side by side, you're not going to notice much of a difference. The one downside to oats is in a lot of Oklahoma, it gets cold enough that they winter kill. And so for that reason, I generally recommend wheat, but there's nothing wrong with planting oats if you're just worried about fall attraction. And then finally, cereal rye. Cereal rye is the most winter hardy of the cereal grains. It's a good option to provide some additional forage whenever it's really cold out. It does provide taller structure, which can be desirable or undesirable. From a deer's perspective, maybe it's not that bad. But if I'm managing for turkeys, I'm generally not planting cereal rye. And this picture here shows, just for context, that taller plant is a cereal rye plant surrounded by a field of oats. And, the oats would be similar in height to wheat. And so you can see you definitely get several more feet of height out of cereal rye compared to oats or wheat, which could be good for some species. But again, if I'm managing with turkeys, even as a secondary objective, I'm not planting cereal rye. I'm just sticking to wheat. If you get nothing out of this whole entire program, this should be your take home point. I do not recommend planting ryegrass in food plots for any species. So again, I just talked about cereal rye, but ryegrass is different. I do not like ryegrass. It is again, it's relatively easy to grow. I'm not saying that deer would never eat it. It's in a lot of food plot mixes, though. If you just go buy a bag of seed that's got a deer on the bag, probably about a coin flip of whether it's going to have ryegrass or not, because it's relatively cheap to include and it grows about anywhere. But deer do not eat it nearly as well as they eat a lot of these other plants, and it's not nearly as nutritious. So I strongly recommend against planting ryegrass, and in fact, on many properties, I recommend where it's present anywhere, but especially on a lot of places, it's a problem in food plots because it becomes very aggressive and outcompetes more desirable plantings. So I do not ever plant ryegrass in food plots, and I recommend strongly that you don't either. All right, so moving on to cool season annuals, we can think about annual clovers as well. Annual clovers are a good option and they work really well in conjunction with a cereal grain. So oftentimes I'll mix several annual clovers and a cereal grain for a really good effective plot. And so crimson clover, really is one of the best options. It's relatively cheap. It's very easy to grow and it does a great job. And again, as you can see, produces these nice, pretty flowers in April. Deer really highly select it. Turkeys highly select it. Again, produces a nice looking field in the springtime. So crimson clover to me is one of the more, one of the ones that I include in most mixes that I make. Arrowleaf clover is another one that I pretty commonly use. Again, arrowleaf is a little bit slower to establish, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend planting only arrowleaf because it's going to provide a little bit less attraction during the hunting season. But once that crimson clover dies, if you plant these two in a mix together, that arrowleaf comes on pretty strong and it actually is providing forage on into late June or even early July, some of the time, depending on the rainfall that year. And so by providing a mixture of crimson and arrowleaf clover, you can provide forage from the fall all the way through, say, early July in a single food plot. And best of all, if you do it, if you can get it established the first year, which is pretty easy, you can actually manage for reseeding because both arrowleaf clover and crimson clover are cool, reseeding annual clovers. So again, both of them are going to flower every year. They're going to die, but then all that seed that they produce when they flowered, if you allow them to flower and you manage it appropriately, is going to be there for you the next year. And so this is kind of what this looks like. If I plant a food plot, this is a food plot with a mixture of crimson and arrowleaf clover. There's a little bit of wheat in this plot, but it's mostly just crimson and arrowleaf clover. And this picture I took is in early August. The field is completely dead. I've actually sprayed it with glyphosate just to kill any weeds that were popping up in it. But the field is completely dead. But as you can see on the ground there's a bunch of seed heads of those clovers. And so those are there for us. And so I simply allowed the plot to produce seed. Then I went in there and mowed the plot. So I mowed it, just after I took this picture. And then I got a rain event. And would you look at that? There is clover popping up everywhere. And I did not plant any clover in this field this year. I planted it a couple years before, but I've actually managed this particular field for going on close to a decade without adding any additional seed. And so, as you can see, there's a lot of clover that's germinating that again was there from the previous year because I allowed it to produce seed. And so, by just spraying it in early August and then mowing it or burning it or disking it in late August, early September, you can do the same thing. And so, basically you go from a field that's just, was a good, was a planted food plot the previous year. It's all died. I simply sprayed it one time and then mowed it, allowed the seeds to germinate. And then as you can see, you got more and more coming in, and that's filling out to be a great plot for the fall. The specific mix that I use pretty commonly for this, and this is derived from a mixture that Dr. Craig Harper, who was a mentor of mine that I worked for, he kind of developed. But it's basically 15 pounds per acre of crimson clover, 10 pounds per acre of arrowleaf clover, 40 pounds per acre of wheat and oats. And then I'll also add in there that if you want to kind of take this to the next step, you can include 10 pounds per acre of red clover in that mixture to extend the period in which you'd be providing forage. So, this is a picture of that mixture planted. This picture was taken in late April. So as you can see, the wheat's going to seed, the crimson clover is going to seed. And then this is just a little bit closer up that was taken just a couple weeks after that. You can see that a lot of the crimson is going to seed, but that plant in the middle there is arrowleaf clover. It is starting to come on strong. That arrowleaf clover then provides forage from, say, early May all the way through the end of June. And then again, if we planted that including some red clover, this is what that plot might look like in mid-August. And so again, depends. And if you don't get rainfall for a month, then it's not going to look all that great in August. But if you catch a few summer rains, you're going to have a great looking food plot, and you can basically provide almost year-round forage by planting this mixture. And so I'm a big fan of this mixture. I think that there's a lot of good that comes from it. I will say that the red clover does not reseed. And so basically, if you're managing this as a reseeding food plot, just plant all of this in year one, let it do its thing, and then whenever you go in and spray the plot in August, you're going to kill the red clover that's there. You're going to kill any weeds that have come up, and then just simply spread 10 pounds of red clover seed and mow it. That's all you have to do. The crimson clover and the arrowleaf that went to seed will then reestablish, and then by the following year that red clover is going to come back on strong. So it's really hard to beat this blend from just being economical and very attractive for deer. So moving on a little bit from annuals, I also pretty commonly use perennial clovers when managing for food plots for deer as well as turkeys. Specifically, I like using white red clover. Sometimes I use chicory as well. And these are, peaking in forage at different times. So really thinking about you're going to have a bump in forage production in the fall and say October, November. They're very attractive then, but then really perennials come on strong in April, May, and June to provide good forage availability whenever bucks are growing their antlers and does are trying to produce milk for their fawns. But it's important to recognize that on average, perennial food plots are less attractive to deer and less productive from, say, July through September and then December through February. So that's why I'm not going to plant everything in perennials. I'm just going to plant some areas in perennials. And how you manage those perennials is really important for the longevity of the plot. And the good thing with perennials too is that they're very attractive not only to deer, but if you like to turkey hunt, it's hard to beat a perennial clover plot for a gobbler to come strut in, and certainly broods, especially older broods, will go out in those fields and bug as well. So there's a lot of good that comes from managing perennials for turkeys as well as deer. And so, like I said, though, perennials are not all that difficult to establish. It's pretty similar to any of the other clovers to establish, but a good perennial plot you should get, I'm going to say 5 years from, and really it's not all that difficult to get 6 years or even 7 years from a perennial plot that you manage appropriately. But again, weed control is really important. And so, you're going to think about, number one, you're going to have to use some selective herbicides. I oftentimes, pretty commonly, think about spraying clethodim, which is a grass selective herbicide to kill grasses coming up in my clover fields. I'm going to think about using some imazethapyr or pursuit Again, that's a broad spectrum selective herbicide that's going to kill some grasses and some forbs. I'm especially thinking about using it to control broadleaf weeds. And really, I'm not necessarily saying you have to spray it every spring and every fall, but you need to be checking that field to see, okay, yeah, I need to spray, say there's some grass weeds in the spring, but in the fall there's a bunch of broadleaf weeds that germinated. Thinking about using that at least a couple times a year, or at least checking on the field multiple times a year to see what needs to be sprayed and when is really important. Another thing that you can do to extend the life of perennial food plots is frost seeding. Oftentimes they get relatively sparse just because of either weed pressure, some of the plants died off, grazing pressure, etc. And so if you have some bare patches, or your stand is reduced in density, just simply going out in say February or early March and spreading some additional seed onto those bare patches can be really, really effective to increase the density and get you a little bit more life out of that stand. The other thing that most folks do with perennials, where I think is a mistake, is mowing it too frequently. Now, you are going to have to mow your perennial fields, but you don't need to mow them multiple times throughout the summer. Just simply mowing it once a year in late summer, say right now, really honestly, anytime in August or early September, that's a much more effective approach, an efficient approach to managing these fields. A lot of the time, folks mow them really frequently, and I see all the time on social media and other places, other videos where folks talk about you got to mow clover to control weeds, you got to mow clover to increase forage availability. I'm not going to deep dive this, but I was involved with a pretty extensive project looking at this, and we found that if you mowed your plots once a year in the fall or in the late summer, compared to mowing it once a month throughout the summer, you actually got just as high of quality of forage. So mowing does not change forage quality. Mowing did reduce the structure, so it reduced the height of the plants, but it actually didn't control the weeds. Like most of the weeds are regerminating. And so when you think about that, you're not really helping yourself on weed pressure. And to make matters worse, and this to me was the kicker, you're producing less forage and you have less deer use. So we actually put cameras out and looked at areas that we mowed a lot versus those we didn't. Deer use frequently mowed food plots less often. There's less food there, so it makes sense that they're going to select to use an area with more food that you're not mowing throughout the summer. And so, again, that was a pretty decent project to undertake and think about. And I'm happy to discuss details if desired. But long and the short of it is, you don't need to mow the plots multiple times in the summer because you're not really helping things, and some of the weeds that you're mowing are not actually all that harmful. So in this case here, I've got about as bad of a looking a clover plot as you could really ask for. Most people would be losing their mind at this, but it's common ragweed. It's a great deer forage. The deer are going to eat it just as well as the clover. And took this picture in June. Just let it ride throughout the summertime. Let the deer eat what they were going to. So had some turkeys brooding out in that field, and then I mowed the plot in late summer, like I said. And this is how that plot looked in October. Hardly a weed in sight. And so again, you can really just overlook weed control, or at least you can overlook the mowing component and not think too much about it if you just use the selective herbicides. But again, mowing frequently is a big mistake because again, you're just wasting diesel fuel and you're also reducing deer use of that plot. And so again, some of those weeds that come up, things like daisy, fleabane, ragweed, are good deer forages. And so speaking of maybe plants that you didn't plant, I'm not going to call them weeds here, but native species that come up in your food plots, especially whenever you manage them fallow, planting something like, say, wheat in that top right hand corner picture, and then maybe you don't have plans to plant anything until the following fall. Well, instead of going out and bush hogging the plot and just keeping it short, just leave it be. You can provide excellent brooding cover for turkeys and quail, as well as a lot of the native species are actually good deer forage plants. Just allow them to come on up out of the seed bank and establish. and let them be throughout the summertime. Let the deer eat them. Let the turkeys use them for cover. If you do have some problem plants out in the field, you can go out there and kill them. But again, instead of just frequently mowing your plots, if you're not planning on planting them in the summertime, just leave them be, control the plants that are problem, and then go in there the same time that you normally would, you know, mow them, spray them, get them ready for planting. I mean, you're still going to have things you have to do the following fall, but you're not really helping yourself by just mowing them frequently. Instead, you're just taking food off the table. And so, again, like I said, it's a good opportunity to control problem plants. This field being overtaken by ryegrass, I'm not going to let this just stand. I am going to, well, this is already too far gone, but if this were mine, I would have killed that ryegrass out to make sure that I'm not having problems going forward. Another specific, kind of case study or thing that you could do to plant food plots more efficiently and think about areas that you might plant to be a little bit more creative about it is actually planting your fire breaks. So if you're using fire on a property that you're managing, thinking about planting fire breaks is a good way to provide attractive forage in proximity to cover, while also really helping out your fire management. So, here I planted a mixture of crimson clover and wheat. I plan to burn one side of the fire break in February or March of this year. Well, it's great because I've now got a green fire break that I'm not going to have to worry about going out and disking it or doing anything in the fall. And so, not only that though, it's an excellent opportunity for gun hunting if I've got a long straightaway. It's important though to consider not only the amount of sunlight that's reaching the ground. If you've got a fire break either in the woods or on the edge of the woods, you're not going to be able to get much to grow there. But also, you need to consider normal agronomic practices. So don't just say, well, because it's a fire break, I'm not going to amend the soil. No, you still need to amend the soil. You still need to, plant appropriately. But, it is a little easier to do those things on a small scale as opposed to a bigger scale. Speaking of thinking about things on a small scale, it's pretty common to think about having small hunting plots, or some folks would call them kill plots. Um, and just a couple of quick tips again. Number one, don't overlook those typical agronomic practices. You still need to amend the soil. You still need to control weeds. You still have to have sunlight to let the plants grow. And so here in this picture, we actually have gone in and killed a bunch of trees on the side of the plot where the sun would be coming. And that's going to allow us to get more sunlight onto the food plot to let it grow more effectively. The other thing that I recommend is planting it to grazing tolerant species like, just simply clovers and wheat is a great option on a relatively small food plot. Again, you don't have to overthink it. If it's something the size that's say a quarter to a half acre, just plant something good there, follow the typical practices. But again, killing some trees on the edges of the plot can be a good way to add some acreage and make sure that you're getting the most forage production out of that acreage, because it's really common to see folks have either trees out in the middle of the plot or on the edges of the plot. And, yeah, it's a small field, but you're eating up a lot of that acreage with areas that are not growing as well as they could because of the shade from the trees. And so killing some trees around the plots is a good way to really help that. From a hunting perspective, food plots can be a great tool, but I do think it's important to think about things strategically. You want to try to do everything in your power to reduce hunting pressure on food plots. So considering your entry route, considering your exit route, not walking across the food plot. I mean, if I'm hunting a food plot and I have to walk across it, I'm doing something wrong, and I need to figure out a way to fix that. You don't if you're having to bump deer off the plot every time you go in and out, those deer are going to respond to that and they're going to start avoiding it, especially older age class bucks. With that being said, another thing I think about is actually not having my stands right on the edge of the plot. I want to actually move them back off the plot, especially if I'm gun hunting, say 20 to 30 yards, such that when my feet hit the ground, they're not hitting the edge of the food plot. They're hitting, ideally native vegetation that's kind of grown up in a screen around the plot, and then I can just ease out without having to walk across that plot. It's a really simple step to really greatly increase the number of deer that you're going to see. I also recommend managing the area surrounding food plots for cover. Um, as opposed to just having a food plot that's in an island of non-cover, either closed canopy woods or, relatively short overgrazed fields. Think about how I can improve the cover around the plot because a deer is going to be more comfortable going out in that plot in daylight. If you don't just have, no cover around the field, if they have cover there and they can just get up out of their beds and walk 50 yards into the plot, you're much more likely to see them in daylight. And so, you can think about this creatively, planting little strips out in areas providing greater cover. In this case, that buck is just a couple steps away from cover either way, and so much more likely to see better deer use in this instance as opposed to if you say planted a big field that they did not have cover surrounding it. Another thing that I really like to see folks do is put an exclusion cage in every single food plot on their property. And most people don't do it. And I know, it's a little bit of extra work, but it really tells you why your food plot failed. For example, in this instance here, we've got a soybean plot that is absolutely getting hammered by deer. And yeah, I could probably look at the plants surrounding that cage, even if the cage wasn't there, and say, yep, it's getting overgrazed by deer. But if you don't have any plants left because it got overgrazed that hard that it literally killed all the plants, well, did your plot fail because it didn't rain? Did your plot fail because you didn't plant the seeds right? Or did your plot fail because of deer? And so putting a cage in every plot is a really easy step just to ensure that you know how successful your plot is, how much are deer using it, and it can also help you identify whether forage is limiting. If you're seeing some moderate level of difference, okay, that's fine. Deer are just using the plot. But if you're seeing absolute failed food plots and cages that are, hip high, then that's a real problem. And that can not only tell you that you should add more food, both in the form of food plot acreage, as well as in native vegetation communities by doing things like cutting trees, adding prescribed fire, killing non-native grasses, but also, maybe you need to reduce deer density. Maybe there's too many mouths on your property. And if your food plots are failing because of that, well, that's an easy fix. Some trigger finger management, harvesting antlerless deer can do worlds of good towards improving the food availability on your property, as well as, over time, the body size and the antler size of the deer that you're going to be seeing. And so, just kind of wrapping this up, food plots are an excellent way to provide high quality forage and attraction for deer. Before you get started, it's important to evaluate why am I planting a food plot? What species do I want to plant for, etc. And then, simply just follow normal agronomic practices. This is not rocket science. You don't necessarily have to go buy some expensive bag of seed that's marketed towards hunters to grow bigger deer or have some, crazy attraction. The reality is, if you just amend the soil, control weeds, plant your seed right at the right time, and pick a common sense blend, you're going to be way ahead of most people with regards to the food plots on your property, and that's going to be much more important than picking this variety of clover or that. And so I think that keeping things simple is really the best approach for food plots. A couple resources that are readily available for folks interested. The one on the left is an OSU Extension publication, a practical guide to food plots in the Southern Great Plains. That's a good resource available on the Extension website. I'll also plug that on the right is actually from the University of Tennessee Extension. It's called A Landowner's Guide to Wildlife Food Plots. It's just another great resource that's available free online for further reading if you're interested. And with that, if we've got any questions, happy to stick around on the call and take any questions that folks may have. Really appreciate y'all sticking around. And again, like I said, my contact information is available online. If you got any questions, I'm more than happy to take them.
If you guys do have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask questions. I'll give some time for that. But I did have a couple of questions for you, Mark. When we're thinking about fertilizing, how soon before planting are we needing to fertilize for like fall, cool season type food plots?
Yep. So generally, I'm thinking about just fertilizing the day that I plant. There's no harm in fertilizing earlier, but just for simplicity's sake, I'm not necessarily thinking about going out early to add some fertilizer. I'm probably just going to go out the same day that I plant, add the fertilizer then, and let that be that. Lime's really the only one that you need to think about getting in the ground much earlier.
Okay. And when we're talking about planting it with some rain too, how much rainfall? I know sometimes that can be hard to tell, and that's probably a depends question, but on average, or just a good guideline, how much rainfall would we want to be looking for?
Yeah, so I like it at least a half inch of rain. I mean, 3/4 to an inch is better, but if it looks like I'm only going to get, say, a third of an inch or a quarter inch, I I mean, at some point you got to risk it. But I'm probably, if it looks like, say, especially in, say, early September, ooh, well, I've got a quarter inch of rain, forecast today, but nothing for the next week after that. Well, I'm probably not going to risk that. Whereas if I'm in, say, mid-October and I need, I have not been able to plant because it's just been dry. And then I've got, 3 days in a row with a quarter inch each. Well, maybe I'll take that risk at that point. But yeah, I tend to like at least a half inch of rain. And best case scenario, several rain events over about a week's time, if possible. But you're always guessing with the weather.
I was gonna say in Oklahoma that may never happen. So
Yep. Yep.
um another question I had, you know, I know it's super important on the moisture side when we're establishing and planting. But once that stand is kind of established, how drought tolerant are these different seed mixes that we could use?
Yeah, great question. So once they're established, for the most part, if you get them good and established in the fall, I'm not too worried most of the time about limited rainfall throughout the winter time. So most of the time you're going to be fine from, as long as you get them established, you're going to be fine from, say, November through say March or April. If it turns dry and you're not getting, which usually most of the time we're going to get some rain in April, May. So if you catch those rains, good. If for whatever reason you don't catch rain in April and May, um, then number one, good on you because you probably didn't have a tornado come through. But on
Right.
the flip side of that, yeah, a lot of those species like arrowleaf clover and red clover, some of the perennial clovers may start to fade. Most of the time, once we get into, say, July and August, you know, the stuff's going to be, your plots are probably going to be looking pretty rough if you're just using cool season annuals like I've discussed today. Now, things like soybeans or cowpeas or joint vetch that are planted in the summertime, they can tolerate some more of that drought. But the cool season plantings, whether perennial or annual, most of them, if it turns dry, time you get into July and August, they're going to be looking pretty rough. But you know, the perennials are just dormant, so you get that good rainfall, that first good rainfall in the fall, they're going to come springing right back on. So yeah, most of the stuff that I discussed today is relatively drought tolerant once it gets established. But again, you may have some periods where it looks pretty rough because it's not going to be actively growing.
Awesome. Thank you. We did get one question in the chat. Arthur asked, what about fruit in or around your plot?
Yeah, absolutely. So planting fruit trees is another way to kind of add some attraction to the plot. Um, either apple trees or pear trees are pretty good options. Um, the one thing that I will say about so I like having trees. The one thing that I will say is that if you're going to plant trees, you got to make sure that you do it right. And so ensure that you have the ability to get water on them, you cage them appropriately, you manage them appropriately. Um, I've been on way too many properties where people have wasted a lot of time and money uh, planting, planting trees in general, and especially planting fruit trees. So if you're going to do it, make sure that you are fully committed. And I would much rather see you plant, say, three or four uh, fruit trees and do it right as opposed to planting 100 and kind of halfway doing it. Because the reality is, if you're not watering those things, especially this time of year, I mean, they're going to die, and you're not going to be able to hold on to them. So if you're going to do it, make sure that you commit to keeping them alive. But yeah, I certainly, I don't dislike fruit trees, and I think you can add some attraction, but you got to make sure that you're getting on the property often enough to get them watered and keep them alive if you go that route. So yeah, great question.
Awesome. And you mentioned, fire is a great tool to clear off like some of the thatch that they may be dealing with. What about some other benefits of prescribed burns,
Yeah,
specifically
yeah.
for wildlife?
So prescribed fire is easily the best tool that we have to manage wildlife. Deer, turkey, quail habitat in Oklahoma. For deer, promotes the fresh resprouting plants that are going to be more nutritious. You can improve nesting and brooding cover for those birds with fire. So yeah, fire to me is the backbone of habitat management for most of these game species that we have here in Oklahoma. I can use it in food plots. I can also, like I said, use food plots as fire breaks, or I can plant fire breaks as part of a food plot. But yeah, if I'm trying to have bigger deer on my property or more turkeys or more quail, I'm absolutely using prescribed fire. And especially in most of Oklahoma, I'm using it pretty frequently.
Awesome. And while we're waiting on some other questions to come through, if you guys have any other questions, I did want to share with you guys about another upcoming program that we have. It's our Fall Prescribed Fire Workshop and Field Day on September 23rd. Um, Mark is going to be back to talk about some benefits on wildlife and do a deeper dive into that. But we also have our prescribed fire specialists coming, like John Weir and Laura Goodman. She's one of our range management specialists. She does a lot of work with fire too. So if you guys are interested in maybe how to incorporate prescribed fire into your food plots or into some of your land management practices, we do have that coming up. It's going to be at the John 316 Mission Refuge Farm and Ranch on, like I said, Wednesday, September 23rd. We'll start with registration around 9:30 that day, get started with the program at 10 o'clock in the morning, and then depending on how the burn goes and things like that, we'll probably wrap up around 2:30 or 3 in the afternoon. And if weather and everything else cooperates with us that day, we're actually going to do a live burn. So it'd be a really good opportunity if you haven't seen a prescribed burn before, to get to see one, to get to be involved in one actively, do some hands-on things with that, and just learn all the ins and outs of prescribed fire. So I wanted to share that with you guys. And it looks like too, if I can switch my screens back, looks like we might have another comment. Arthur said, great information tonight. Thank you. Thank you, Arthur. And then two, I did quickly want to go through a couple of other resources for you guys. One is learn.extension.okstate.edu. It is our online learning modules. And if you guys can see my screen, there's lots of listings on here. They're online learning modules. They're self-paced. So typically, by the time you log in and start the class, normally you have 30 to 120 days, depending on the course, to take that. Some ones that might be helpful for you guys are the agronomy ones, going through soil fertility, land management, things like that. And then if you're again interested in prescribed fire, there's an introduction to prescribed fire online um, course as well. And then lastly, there is the Wildlife Food Plots app that some of our specialists at OSU have worked on. From what I understand, has different wildlife on there that you can select planting seasons. It'll give you a plant list, some different options, and maybe some more unique options that you could try. And then we also have our extension homepage. If you go to fact sheets, you can search tons and tons of topics. We have some good fact sheets related to wildlife and food plots, and the guide to food plots that Mark mentioned that was from OSU. You can find it linked on here too. You can search guide to food plots and that will pop up. So those are some resources available to you guys. If you have any other questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I can get you into contact with Mark and help you ask those questions. And two, he mentioned already, but I did want to stress the importance of doing the soil testing. Like he mentioned, it's a very, very cheap thing that we can do to give us some really good information on soil fertility in those food plots. Generally, 10 to 14 business days is all the time that it takes to get your results back, and those results will come tailored to what type of food plot you have, and we'll tell you exactly how much fertilizer you'll need, if you need to add lime to adjust pH, how much to apply, when to do those things. So really, really good information to have, all for 15 bucks. So if that's something that I can help you with, don't hesitate to reach out to me. If you guys don't have any more questions, I'm gonna stop the recording.